Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, one of the most requested games for me to add to the benchmark roster has been Call of Duty Warzone. So yesterday, after spending 25 hours downloading it, I finally got it installed and I couldn't wait to see just how it performed on some of my older and weaker graphics cards. So let's get straight into it, take a look at the lineup of cards and then jump straight into the 660 Ti gameplay. So from left to right we have the GTX 660 Ti, the RX 550, the R9 Fury, the GTX 590 and the GTX 480. Two of these cards won't run the game and I'm sure you can probably tell which ones, but more on that later. Now, because this is an online FPS title, I think that getting as close to 60 frames per second is quite important here. So that is the target that I had in mind throughout. So what I did was tweak the settings in order to achieve as close to 60 frames per second as possible. So starting off with the GTX 660 Ti from Nvidia, and we had to turn things down to 720p low in order to get anywhere near 60, and even doing so, well, the frame rate wasn't entirely solid. Now you can play at higher resolutions, namely 900p and 1080p, but at 1080p I found that you're going to be hovering around 30 to 40 FPS, with some drops into the mid-20s. For me, that's not ideal with a game like this. I mean, I'm bad enough at it anyway, even without the low frame rate. But if you want to play at that resolution with at least 30 frames per second, then you should still be able to do so. My personal preference, though, would be to try and target 60 frames per second due to the competitive nature of this game. Now, the 660 Ti has 2GB of VRAM. There is a 3GB version out there, but this 2GB VRAM version does mean that we are limited even more so when it comes to adjusting the graphical options, though just in general, the power of the card will not allow us to really hit a smooth 60 FPS. I imagine then that you probably wouldn't want to go any lower than a 600 series card from Nvidia if you're looking to get a solid frame rate out of this game. I have paired the card with a Ryzen 5 1600 AF edition, 16 gigs of 3200 MHz DDR4, and I'm running the game from a 1TB SSD. Next up we have the AMD R9 Fury. This is a 4GB HBM card. It has high bandwidth memory. It was once a very good card indeed. This is not the Fury X, so it's not quite as good, but even so, the R9 Fury from AMD will be able to maintain at least 60 frames per second at 1080p with the high settings. We also had SMAA enabled, set at 1 times, so we didn't really push it too far, but 1080p 60 FPS with the R9 Fury is possible. Not too surprising considering just a few years ago this was one of the best graphics cards that you could buy. It was expensive, but the price reflected its performance. These days there will be some instances where it suffers, but Call of Duty Warzone, Battle Royale, whatever you want to call it, seems to run absolutely fine on this card. And I dare say that you could probably turn the resolution up a little more as well. Don't quote me on that, it may end in disaster. I didn't try it any higher than 1080p, but at 1080p with this beast of a GPU, you are going to have a good power-hungry time. That is, of course, a constant downside of ownership of an R9 Fury. It always has been. Still, the card didn't get too loud either under load, which was rather surprising, but it could have something to do with the massive fans. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have the AMD RX 550. Now, when this launched, it was an entry-level card. I think it cost about $79 in the United States, or the equivalent in your country, of course. Here in the UK, I think it could be found for about $59 at one point, so just for a basic display adapter, so to speak, it really wasn't too bad at all. It gave you more performance than something like a GT 710, and it only cost £10 or £20 more, so it really wasn't too bad for the price. At 720p with the lowest settings, unfortunately we couldn't really get a playable frame rate, but we will be returning to this card later and trying at even lower tweaked settings, so stick around for that one. First though, let's address the GTX 480 and the GTX 590, both from Nvidia. Now back in the day, these two were flagship GPUs. The 480 was one of the first DirectX 11 cards, and the 590 was one of the best dual graphics cards that money could buy. These days, of course, SLI is pretty much obsolete, and even so, trying to run Call of Duty Warzone with either one or two of the onboard GPUs will result in this message. The same goes for the 480. Call of Duty Warzone is not playable with either of these two cards. I've tried a few tweaks that I found online, but nothing really worked, and even if it did, I can't imagine that we would see a very good frame rate anyway, even with the lowest settings. But now it's time for the trick up my sleeve. You want to play this game, you have a terrible graphics card, say the RX 550, and during my time testing this game, something was playing on my mind, and that is that there were other unexplored graphical options, and I had a feeling that if we made use of them, we should be able to see at least 30 FPS. Now, what I'm about to do is something that no PC gamer wants to do, and that is resort to 800 by 600 resolution. Yes, this game still supports 800 by 600. Now, if you're running your screen at a native 720p or 1080p, you can't turn the render scale down and run at 800 by 600. You actually have to set the native resolution to 800 by 600 from the in-game menu. And once you've done that, well, you can't turn the render scale down anymore. So that is the lowest resolution possible for this title. Maybe some INI tweaks may be able to help in this situation, but I'm not sure whether or not they would work in this game. But 800 by 600 then with the RX 550, and well, we were able to see not just 30 but 60 frames per second. Just look at this cinematic experience. Bars at the top and bottom of the screen, 60 FPS. I was actually quite surprised at the difference between 800 by 600 and 1280 by 720. So I guess in the end it was a pretty playable result, and I can't help but think if the 480 and 590 were to run the game, that this resolution would certainly help out a lot. But there we go. So there we have it, Call of Duty Warzone is playable on even a lightweight entry-level RX 550, I almost said 5500 then, from AMD. Please do not confuse the 5500 with a 550, because if you intend to buy a 5500 and end up with a 550, you will be wholeheartedly disappointed. Now, interestingly, there are a few sets of specifications from Activision. You have the minimum specifications, recommended, additional, competitive, and RTX, which obviously includes a 2080. Now, as far as the minimum specifications are concerned, you're going to want an i3-4340 or FX 6300, along with a 670, 1650 or Radeon HD 7950, which, to be honest, sounds about right. If you are playing with a 670, then again I'd estimate that you probably have to turn the resolution down a little bit to hit 60 FPS, because the 670 and 660 Ti, I can't imagine are too different in 2020. The 1650 sounds like the best bet out of all of those. In terms of recommended specs, well, you've got the 970, 1660, R9 390 or RX 580. Now, I'm not sure how different the R9 390 and R9 Fury are in terms of performance, but if the 390 is anything like the Fury, then yes, you're probably going to be able to see at least 60 FPS, especially when paired with the recommended 2500K or Ryzen 5 1600X. The 1600 AF was the processor I was using, and I had absolutely no issues. What I will say though is that you're probably going to want quite a bit of RAM. 12GB is recommended, and that seems about right. You're more than likely to have 16 though, as opposed to 12, unless you're running with an older rig. But all in all, there are plenty of settings to choose from. The game can be tweaked to your liking, and best of all, it is free. So if you have a system, you're not sure how well it runs, and you've got terrible internet with 25 hours to spare, then it's worth downloading and giving it a go for yourselves. Now, I've got to be honest, it's not my sort of game. I'm more in it for the performance statistics. I like to see just how well games run as opposed to playing them a little more these days, especially multiplayer online games like this. But that's all that's left to say, really. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it down below. If you didn't enjoy this video, well, leave a dislike on it down below. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.